I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Last Call for Wednesday the 29th of July. I'll be back with Heads Up Thursday 10 a.m. Hopefully catch you then. In poll results, there's little to separate NBR poll participants' opinions about what will happen with prison operator Serco's contract. Serco has come under fire in recent weeks as a string of recent controversies over prison violence and organised boxing fights came to light. Last week, Corrections announced it would take over the management of Mount Eden Prison from Serco. Serco wardens remain at the prison, but a corrections management team of 20 staff moved in on Monday. Corrections boss Ray Smith said there are also other options potentially available to me under the contract. These include a final warning and early termination of the contract. The corrections boss has described the situation as salvageable. Mr. Smith ordered Serco to pay $560,000, including penalties, earlier this week over recent events at the prison. Asked if Serco will jump before it's dropped, there was little to separate NBR poll participants. Some 34% say Serco will walk away from the deal with the government as it's making a loss anyway, but another 34% disagree, saying Serco will hang on. A further 32% say neither opinion is likely, and as bad as Serco's performance is, publicly run prisons are worse. Labour's corrections spokesman Kelvin Davis has been critical of Serco's management of Mount Eden Prison, as well as the government's reaction to the saga. He told NBR Radio last week the private prison experiment has been an utter failure in New Zealand. He says the government should have known better, as Serco has a dodgy reputation overseas. He says the government should have read the tea leaves and never even gone there with Serco. Last week, Mr. Davis tweeted that Serco was entitled to $1.2 million in performance-related bonuses. Mr. Davis tweeted, "I say give it to the people who've been abused in Serco's care." In business news, Affinity Equity Partners, the Pan-Asian private equity firm, has approached a number of investment banks as it looks to sell New Zealand's largest poultry business, Tegel Foods. Investment bankers have confirmed to Business Desk that Affinity is considering a trade sale or IPO of the Auckland-based poultry business. The Australian Financial Review yesterday reported the sale could fetch about 900 million Australian dollars. Affinity bought Tegel from Pacific Equity Partners in 2011 for a reported $600 million, and since then has divested the company's property, including the sale of 2 long-leased chicken processing plants to buyers including Wellington-based Kaniwi Capital for $60 million in July 2013. Tegel reported a profit of $14.1 million on sales of $517.2 million in the year ended April 27, 2014, according to the last accounts filed by holding company Ross Group Holdings. At balance date, the company had bank borrowings of $214.9 million, which were repayable in 2 years, and $60.4 million of mezzanine debt repayable in 3 years. The majority of New Zealand's chicken industry is owned by private equity investors after Ingham's Enterprises New Zealand, the country's second largest poultry producer, was sold along with its Australian parent Ingham Enterprises to TPG for $880 million Australian in June 2013. Dutch agricultural lender Rabobank has forecast global demand for poultry will increase 60% to become the most consumed meat globally by 2030. In People News, Invercargill-based accountant James Hennessy has been suspended from practising as a chartered accountant for 2 years and ordered to pay $17,360 in costs after being found guilty of misconduct in a professional capacity. During the New Zealand Institute of Chartered Accountants disciplinary hearing yesterday, Mr. Hennessy had pled guilty to a lesser charge of conduct unbecoming to an accountant. However, the disciplinary tribunal chairman Mike Whale said the offences Mr. Hennessy had admitted to are sufficiently serious to warrant him being found guilty of the higher charge. Mr. Hennessy's actions being examined included various breaches of NZICA's Code of Ethics, various failures to deal with conflicts of interest, failing to advise a client that the client had security over certain assets, and putting his own interests ahead of those of clients. Mr. Hennessy's legal advisor, Roger Eagles, indicated he was particularly worried about the impact of having his name published, but Mr. Whale denied name suppression. NZICA had censured Mr. Hennessy in 2011 in a case not made public, which involved a conflict of interest and of which Mr. Eagles had been unaware. NZICA again censured Mr. Hennessy in December 2012 for a perceived conflict of interest that breached NZICA's Code of Ethics, and that time the decision was made public. The latest case dates back to 2005, when Mr. Hennessy, then working for accounting firm WHK, was already the accountant of businessman X. The names of his client and all third parties have been suppressed. He also became a trustee of X's trust, but failed to identify any actual or perceived conflict of interest in the dual roles. In late 2008, X saw a business opportunity in the fact that the global financial crisis meant that a lot of expensive boys' toys such as jet skis and motorcycles such as Harley-Davidsons were being auctioned in the US as a result of their owners' financial distress. X decided to start a business with 3 other people importing these jet skis and motorcycles, expecting to sell them at a profit, but which was ultimately unsuccessful. In September of the following year, the new business was struggling and was short of cash, and X asked Mr. Hennessy, who he knew had just sold a dairy farm and therefore had available cash, to invest in the business. The nature of Mr. Hennessy's initial $300,000 investment, whether it was debt or equity, was never properly documented, although he advanced the money on an interest-free basis. Mr. Eagles argued that Mr. Hennessy's investment wasn't properly documented because the business's directors refused to sign the security document. The business's bank account required 2 signatures to withdraw funds, and Mr. Hennessy and other WHK partners were signatories. In December 2009, Mr. Hennessy began writing cheques to repay some of the money he'd lent the business, although he also lent the business smaller amounts of money as well. Mr. Eagles said the business directors were aware of these repayments, but prosecutor Richard Moon objected to that, saying there was no evidence to support it. By April 2010, the business owed Mr. Hennessy over $160,000, but X's trust was owed over $235,000. In total, the business's loss was estimated at over $208,000, and advances from shareholders were over $512,000. For a more in-depth look at this story, nbr.co.nz.
NBR Radio with Bayleys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
Wednesday the 29th of July. I'm Andrew Patterson. This is NBR Radio. Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler delivering a speech today, much anticipated and closely watched by market followers. Joining us with his impressions, Rob Hosking. What did you make of it, Rob?
Well, to be honest, it wasn't a huge surprise, most of what he had to say, although it seems to have surprised quite a few people. There was an expectation, I think, well, it seems there was an expectation that he would be a bit more downbeat than he turned out to be about the overall economy, and in particular that he might signal that he would go further with cutting interest rates. And instead, he came out and said, look, we're looking at a bit of sub-trend growth, which we weren't looking at 6 weeks ago. But we're still looking at output of around 2.5% annual growth. And if people think he's going to go berserk and cut interest rates willy-nilly, they've got him quite wrong.
We spoke yesterday about this kind of balancing act that he had about not excessively talking things down, but at the same time not appearing to be too optimistic. Did he kind of hit that middle note?
Well, if you look at the financial markets, you'd have to say not, but then the financial markets tend to overreact to sort of anything, pretty much. I swear you could make the dollar shift if you sneaked up behind one of these jokers and popped a paper bag. And it looks as if, he came out and said, look, the dollar should be lower. And what does the dollar do? It jumps up. And that does seem to have come back to the expectation that he would be a lot more, or at least a bit more pessimistic about the economy than he has been. He come out and said, look, the labour market is, job market participation is still extraordinarily strong. We've still got record net inwards migration, and construction is still running very strong. It's going to be running strong for quite some time. In fact, it's going to have to be if we're going to have any sort of catch up on housing supply in Auckland. And effectively, it's a reminder that dairying is not the economy, and the services sector is running, which is still the biggest part of our economy is services, by a considerable margin, and that's running very, very strong. If you look at the most recent monthly data on it, it's actually in bigger expansion mode than it has been for nearly 12 months. So it's the other thing, as far as interest rates go, the message here was, look, yes, inflation is well below the target range. Yes, if you're being sort of strictly, I suppose, almost bureaucratic about this, you'd say, look, you need to cut interest rates quickly to get things down so inflation comes back up. But the other thing he stressed quite strongly is that the other part of his brief is he's got to manage things so they don't cause excessive volatility. And really, quite explicitly said this morning, look, if I cut interest rates too far, too fast, we're going to see volatility, or any more, we're going to see extra volatility in the economy, and in particular in the housing market. I suspect if he did an aggressive interest rate cut, then certainly you'd be pouring a bit more petrol on that market, on that burning fire already. a lot more measured about this.
The other part of this, of course, is the surprise around still wanting to talk the dollar down, and because there does seem to be a sense that the dollar is kind of where it's in a bit of a natural sweet spot. But, of course, he never reveals actually where he does want the dollar to actually be.
No, and you're right, it is around. One thing he did say is that it's around about the long-term equilibrium at the moment. But he also went on to say that because of the downturn in our export markets, and in particular dairy basically at the moment, the other meat and other main exports actually aren't doing too badly. It should be lower, and in particular it should be lower because of our long-term, the massive what we sort of used to call current account deficit, and we still do to a degree, but the technical term they now use is net external liabilities, and they have dropped quite a lot as a proportion of GDP over the last 5 years. They're still running a lot worse than they should be, and as a proportion of GDP, and we really need to be getting those down and paying off that long-term debt, that deficit, which hit us. We've been carrying that since 1973, and that's one of the reasons over the longer term our interest rates are higher than they might be in other countries, is because we have this long-term current account deficit, or net external liabilities, whatever you want to call it, and that's, if the dollar adjusts downwards, that makes it basically easier to cut into that long-term deficit. Unfortunately, the dollar jumped, so now that might just be the financial markets overreacting, as they tend to do. It may come off. We'll have to wait and see.
Just finally, Rob, did he talk much around specifically the flow-on effect from this lower dairy price? Obviously, we know it's going to affect farmers, but we also know that it affects regional economies very significantly. Is that something the Reserve Bank is factoring in, perhaps more than it might have been at the start of the year?
Oh, certainly more than they were at the start of the year. You talked a little bit about that, and they're certainly watching that because we saw some of that in some of the other economic data that's come out in the last few weeks. It was very noticeable, the last NZIER quarterly survey of business opinion, which is a very wide-ranging, long-term, forward economic indicator, and we've got, it's been running since 1970. Retail was particularly pessimistic, and if you drilled into sort of where that was coming from, it was very noticeable that retailers in regions with a high amount of dairy activity, such as Waikato and Taranaki, were the most pessimistic. That's certainly going to have a flow-on effect there. The question is the extent to which it flows on elsewhere. And what's been actually quite noticeable in previous downturns like this is where farmers have cut back has been more on the investment side than on the spending. So, on their sort of operating spending, as it were. So, this might be a bit sharper. We'll have to wait and see. There's certainly been so much talk about this downturn that I sort of sometimes think that the down-on-the-mouth chatter is actually worse than the hard data would.
Thanks for joining us, Rob Hosking, with some thoughts on Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler's speech delivered earlier today here on NBR Radio.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
In market news, Coates Group, the company that grew out of diversified investor Guinness Peat Group, says the sale of its EMEA crafts business to Aurelius Group will be completed on Friday, although the loss on sale won't be announced until its first half results due on August 3. The UK-based threadmaker first announced the sale of its Europe, Middle East and Asia crafts unit for $10 million on February 19. Today it described the sale as a complex, multi-jurisdictional transaction which had been completed against a backdrop of increasingly poor market conditions which have affected the trading performance of EMEA crafts. Accordingly, it said in a statement, Coates has agreed to a nominal final consideration payable to Coates compared to an original consideration of $10 million. An amount of cash broadly in line with the original terms of the sale will be retained within the business being sold, which will result in the transaction being cash negative. The precise quantum of the loss on disposal will be determined on completion and reported in the 2015 full-year results. The EMEA crafts business will be listed as a discontinued item in the first half results. In February, Chief Executive Paul Forman said the sale better positions Coates for future profitable growth and allows us to focus management attention on our high-performing global industrial and strong Americas crafts businesses. The shares last traded at 60.5 cents on the NZX. Business News: Tex Edwards has put his 2 Degrees shares up for sale on Trade Me with a starting price of $10 million. Mr. Edwards, who founded the telco, owns a 0.48% slice of the company through his investment vehicle KLR Holdings. True to his maverick nature, the entrepreneur has taken an unusual route for an asset of this size, listing it in the auction site's business for sales section. Mr. Edwards says, to a degree, it's a fishing expedition. I want to see if there's anybody out there interested. The auction was for half of his 2 Degrees stake. According to 2 Degrees Company's office filing for the year to December 31st, 2014, posted May 26, the company has a book value of $96 million, down from the previous year's $122 million, putting Mr. Edwards' asking price at the ambitious end of the spectrum. The company reported a net loss of $33.6 million in the 12 months to December 31st, 2014, a slight improvement on the $35.9 million it lost in 2013. Revenue was $399.6 million, a 29% gain on the previous year's $308.7 million. On an EBIT basis, the company lost $9.9 million against its 2014 EBIT loss of $19 million. On an EBITDA basis, 2 Degrees was in the black to the tune of $58 million, a 29% improvement on the previous year's $45.3 million. Chief Executive Stuart Sheriff recently told NBR the telco has 1.3 million active customers, but will not give a contract versus prepay breakout or other metrics. To China, Chinese shares have fallen for a third straight day, but investors are no wiser whether the government will take new steps to prop up the market. Trading yesterday started with heavy losses, taking the Shanghai Composite Index down to 3,537.36, just points away from the low reached during a sell-off this month that wiped out nearly one-third of the value of the Shanghai market. But the market bounced back before the midday break, buoyed by large-cap stocks, and traded in a narrower range in the afternoon session. The Shanghai Composite Index finished down 62.56 points, or 1.7%, having fallen as much as 5% and risen as much as 1% earlier. The index has shed 11% since Friday and is down nearly 30% from its mid-June high. The smaller Shenzhen Composite closed down 48.39 points, or 2.2%, after falling more than 6% earlier on Tuesday. The smaller cap Chinext board closed down 3.7%. The losses are casting doubt on Beijing's ability to contain a slide that has wiped trillions in value from Chinese equities and have left investors and analysts wondering what officials might do next to reverse it. On Monday, a government spokesman said the state's share-buying agency planned to step up its purchases of stocks after the Shanghai market fell 8.5%, the biggest one-day decline since 2007. Shares elsewhere in the region fell in early trading but regained ground as the losses in China narrowed. The Hang Seng Index gained 0.6%, although a gauge of Chinese firms listed in Hong Kong remained down 0.5%. Japan's Nikkei stock average fell 0.1%, and Australia's S&P ASX 200 closed down 5.2 points, or 0.1%. South Korea's Kospi closed marginally higher at 2039.1.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant now offering Auckland's most exclusive private dining room. NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 29th of July. I'm Andrew Patterson. This is Foreign Affairs Scope, and with me Nathan Smith. Nathan, let's start with Turkey. It seems to be showing its hand at last.
Yeah, after a good couple of years sitting on the sidelines, deciding not to do anything, which is inaction, it's now sat down with the United States, and they've come up with some sort of way to get involved in the fight to its southern border, especially in Syria. But the idea is to get them involved in fighting the Islamic State, and to do that, they have hired out or leased Incirlik Air Base and potentially a few others in southern Turkey, which will put the US in a nice close spot to deal with the encroaching IS movements in northern Syria. But it solves two problems for the United States and the international coalition there, is that it now looks to create more of a buffer zone for potentially Kurdish people or rebels in that particular region, but it also struggles with it also looks to get rid of the Islamic State movement, especially around Kobani, which was attacked earlier in the year. So a couple of problems being solved there. Nevertheless, immediately after that particular US deal was officially signed, the Turks attacked the Kurds as well. And there are multiple different factions of Kurds in that region. I don't know if the US was expecting them to do that or whether they're going to turn a blind eye to the shelling and the airstrikes against the PKK, for instance. But it looks like there was a quid pro quo, a reciprocity. We give you this, you let us do what we need to here. But it does seem to be centering on the question of the Kurds and the question of Damascus. I guess all roads lead to Damascus at the moment.
This is always the interesting aspect of dealing with Turkey. There's so many different factions to it and so many different sort of ideologies involved. The US, of course, does have a track record of tending to choose its partners based on a one-dimensional view of what it needs out of them.
Yeah, at the point, it's a very good point you raise. I mean, the Turks are in an extremely geographically and geopolitically important strategic position. They sort of buffer between Europe and the Middle East, and they've got, obviously, leading back to the Ottoman Empire, quite a lot of clout and experience in that region. But in saying that, people remember that as well, and they don't necessarily like the growth of power and strength that Turkey has accumulated over the past decades or so. Nevertheless, that power and strength is going to have to be used in some way, and I think the Turks are going to be they're going to be able to absorb a lot of the reciprocity attacks that IS are sure to attack with, and also the Kurds are expected to also strike back as well. But the Turks have already rounded up more than 1,000 people involved in the Islamic State supply lines in that country, so they clearly knew what was going on there, and they've got a long history of internal security measures, especially against the Kurds, so they'll know what they're doing there. But it looks like they're finally starting to get into this. All
right, let's talk about Iran, of course, which is being trumpeted by the Obama administration really as the centerpiece of Obama's term in office. How significant is this deal, and what is going to be some of the fallout that might come with it?
Yeah, you're right to point out that it's the lodestar, I think, of the Obama administration. He's struggled to find a coherent foreign policy over his tenure, but nevertheless it has centered around Iran, and a lot of the other things that are happening around the world, especially in Ukraine and in Turkey and in Greece and maybe even down in Saudi Arabia and Israel, have fallen to the wayside, or at least the negotiations in those areas have centered around what plays out with Iran. So now that is controlled and it is over, it really depends on what Iran will do with that next. But the region is realigning now. It has expected the deal to move forward, and now that we have it, it's working with that reality. So first off, we have Iran, and they'll play a defensive game for the while. Rouhani, the president, said, I think yesterday, that he wishes Iran will now have the ability to, quote, cleanse the Middle East of terrorists. So they're looking to compound their control over especially Iraq, which is their main source of control and worry. If an outside power controls Iraq, they're very worried, so they at least need nobody to control it, which is currently what's going on in that country. So they'll start to consolidate in certain areas around there. Saudi Arabia will look to use Sunni proxies around the region in a continuing effort to hopefully band the Sunni region together to counter the new power of Iran. Israel is going to be a US insurance policy. I don't think Netanyahu has it quite right when he says this is the worst thing to happen to the Middle East in decades. I think he's overplaying that, as politicians tend to. But look, they're scared. They also know that they have friends in high places, and that's not going to change either. Turkey, as I said before, is deciding to stretch its geopolitical muscles and will be a counterpoint to Iran's increasing movement. Egypt, the same as Saudi Arabia, will start using more Sunni proxies, and they'll work together to sort of contain the Iran movement here. Iraq, Syria will be the heart of this problem for a while. Chaos will reign, and it's just going to be a matter of who controls that chaos and the emerging factions out of that. Islamic State will remain an excuse, I think, for a lot of these people to do what they're going to do in that region, to control certain factions and geopolitical ideologies, etc. But it will also remain highly divided and fractious, and probably won't become an entity in its own right to counter the other powers around there. And look, finally, the US has now got an excuse to have fewer and far between interventions in the region, now that it has a few players that it can count on that will be competing for its influence and attention.
All right, and let's finally talk about China, because obviously the big focus has been around the continued gyrations of the stock market. It's quite dramatic, actually, when you look at the numbers. The Chinese stock market has fallen from a high of around 10.3 trillion, down more than 3 trillion. It's kind of almost a third over the last month or so. What is this signalling, perhaps, about fundamentally some real deep-seated issues within China itself?
Yeah, you're right. The media seem to focus more on the collapse of the stock market, and maybe people's savings have been destroyed, or the household, or the housing sector, which has dropped it's running at about a third of its capacity, I think, compared to last year at the moment. But look, yeah, you're right. They've dropped $3 trillion, which is the size of the UK economy just in the past couple of months. That's enormous.
Enormous, isn't it?
And they've already got a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. So that's very dangerous territory at the moment. Margin calls, margin lines and stuff, they seem to be part of the problem there. But I think it goes deeper than that, specifically for China, because they're trying to emerge into a new economic process which will rely on greater household spending for products that potentially they don't need, a consumer-based economy. But if your savings are being collapsed and no one knows exactly who's going to back that up, and especially in a stock market, then the savings will be diversified and moved around. The last thing people are going to be wanting to do is spend that money, especially into an economy which might be, as you say, gyrating a little too viciously at the moment. The parallel to that will be, as China's government tries to stem this bloodletting, and it's failing to do so at the moment, because this week has had serious drops back to 2007 levels. That has a bounce-back effect on the politicians, in the sense that if they can't control this, what else maybe can they not control? And so you're starting to see maybe a potential loss of influence from the political parties there. Right at the very critical time, as I said before, of them trying to transition to a new economic balance. That's going to be tough to watch. It's going to be important to watch, and I think we'll need to make sure that New Zealand diversifies outside of that as well.
The other part of this is the potential social fallout from people who have lost their savings, are not in a position to get those savings back by virtue of their age, and then they choose to perhaps blame the government for that.
The social unrest aspect is always a factor when you're talking about China, and that is starting to emerge. Haven't seen a lot of that yet. It's only been a couple of weeks, really, since this has started to tumble around. But a lot of the people that made their money over the last year in the stock market boom, which was now bursting, still have that money. A lot of people are still out ahead of this. There are a serious amount of people and a lot of funds that have collapsed and disappeared now, but it doesn't appear to have reached a critical mass where we'll start to see people on the ground maybe a little bit more annoyed with what's going on. But that also is something to watch.
All right. Thanks for joining us, as always, Nathan Smith, with our regular weekly Foreign Affairs Scope here on NBR Radio.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
Let's talk tech hubs. Auckland Economic Development Agency, ATED, says it's flattering the city was singled out among Australian competitors as a potential tech centre by an international technology trends expert. But it's important to take a less parochial perspective. ATED General Manager Business Innovation and Skills Patrick McVeigh says technology in its broader sense offers opportunities for all of New Zealand and has the ability to transform and disrupt both traditional sectors and create new industries, business models and markets. Mr McVeigh says other New Zealand centres are also performing strongly in the tech space. People offshore are taking notice too. Sam Altman of Y Combinator, which provides seed funding for startups, visited New Zealand late last year and spoke about the huge potential our startup scene has. But Mr McVeigh says we also need to be careful about believing our own hype. Auckland and the rest of New Zealand have a long way to go to challenge other major players in the Asia-Pacific region. Mr McVeigh says the Brookings Institution's Asia-Pacific Metro Monitor 2014 ranks the 100 largest Asia-Pacific metropolitan economies, which account for 20% of global GDP and 29% of global GDP growth in 2014. Auckland is the only New Zealand city to feature in 81st position. He says it's imperative that this ranking improves and that other New Zealand cities find their way onto this list before we can talk about anywhere in New Zealand being a true tech hub. Mr McVeigh says if New Zealand is to achieve this, all main centres need to start thinking globally and look at what competitors across Asia-Pacific and beyond are doing rather than what's happening locally. He said we also need to focus on developing two-way relationships at a region-to-region level, aligned to industries that are both specialised and tradable. He says technology companies present a great opportunity, but it's not just high-tech that New Zealand needs to concentrate on. He says we need to be focusing on what the Brookings Institution calls advanced industries, or industries that invest heavily in R&D and have a high proportion of workers in science, technology, engineering and maths-oriented roles. He says cities that are home to high concentrations of advanced industries are characterised by high-paying jobs and high growth rates. In the US, advanced industries have been adding nearly twice as many jobs as the overall economy since 2010. Mr McVeigh says it's the same story in Asia-Pacific, where the Brookings Institution says metro areas specialising in business, financial and professional services registered the fastest growth in employment in 2014, while the highest GDP per capita growth was recorded in metro areas that specialised in commodities and utilities. The global economy is increasingly focused on cities due to New Zealand's size and relative isolation, according to Mr McVeigh. He says it's important that our cities work together to embrace advanced industries and all that they can do to grow an economy. He says ATEED is working with its counterparts in Wellington, Christchurch and across New Zealand, having hosted them at Grid Auckland and opening sharing lessons good and bad. Auckland has benefited in the same way by learning from counterparts in San Francisco and Los Angeles, including at the recent Tripartite Economic Alliance Summit in Los Angeles. Mr McVeigh says if any regions in New Zealand are to become tech hubs on a global scale, our cities need to continue to build these sorts of relationships and celebrate every new start-up, expansion overseas and inward investment into New Zealand regardless of where this takes place. In communications news, global communications company WPP has made a couple of significant and undisclosed acquisitions in the past year, but financial statements now reveal how much they cost. Late last year, WPP subsidiary JWT acquired 75% of the shares in Wellington-based digital advertising agency Heyday. Accounts filed in the company's office say this cost $2.5 million, but two additional payments totaling $1.47 million will be paid in 2018 and 2020. Heyday founder and managing director Luke Pearson established the agency in 2000 and retains 25% of the shares. Heyday's key clients include ANZ, Z Energy and TradeMe. Heyday employs 35 people and, according to WPP's London Stock Exchange page, had revenues of $4 million for the year ending March 2014 and gross assets of $1.7 million. The documents also say $3.5 million was paid for a 100% acquisition of Chemistry Media, which has been trading as media agency Mediacom. An announcement of the acquisition was made to the London Stock Exchange last month. Mediacom is a subsidiary of WPP's media holding company Group M, which arrived in New Zealand late last year. Clients of Mediacom include BNZ, Fonterra, Nestle and Restaurant Brands, among others. Nigel Douglas, the managing director and former 26% shareholder of Mediacom, is continuing in his role. Blackwood Lamb, which is owned by Bert Lamb and Paul Friedlander, held 65% of Mediacom shares. Mr. Lamb said, "We hand over a strong operation to Group M in the knowledge the company is poised to assume a leadership position in the New Zealand market." Group M New Zealand Chief Executive Sean Seamer told NBR Radio that Group M occasionally has affiliation agreements that allow the use of its media brands. He says it's not common but allows us to deliver consistent offerings across markets regardless of shareholding. Group M is currently in the middle of building up another one of its subsidiaries, Mindshare. NBR understands Group M's competitors tightened up their operations shortly after the conglomerate arrived. Group M is the largest media agency group in most parts of the world, but Nielsen rate cards for agency expenditure say Omnicom's media agencies have long enjoyed dominance in the local market with 34% market share. Group M agencies, including Mediacom, follow in second place with 22%.
Wednesday the 29th of July, NBR Radio, I'm Andrew Patterson. And with me, Jenny Ruth. Jenny, you've been following this case of the Invercargill accountant who's been suspended for 2 years, James Hennessy. Just background the story here, because it really goes to the heart of accountants making sure that they're not crossing across other people's business interests.
Well, conflicts of interest are at the heart of this case, and we learnt during the course of yesterday's hearing this is the third time he's been charged with conflicts of interest in particular cases. In this one, back in 2005, Mr. Hennessy was already an accountant for this businessman. We'll just call him X because all the names of his clients and third parties have been suppressed. X had a trust, and then Mr. X asked him to become a trustee of his trust. Now, there's a pretty obvious conflict of interest there already that you can see, or a perceived conflict of interest. But Mr. Hennessy didn't seem to recognise that and happily became the trustee. And then along in late 2008, Mr. X saw a business opportunity. Because of the global financial crisis, there were a lot of expensive boys' toys such as jet skis and high-branded motorcycles such as Harley-Davidsons coming on the market to be auctioned. And he thought he could import these toys into New Zealand and sell them off here at a profit. The business actually wasn't successful. One of the problems with it was that a lot of these jet skis and motorbikes weren't in a fit state to be sold, so there had to be a lot of repair and refurbishment done. But anyway, by September 2009, the new business was already struggling and was short of cash, and so Mr. X, he knew that Mr. Hennessy had just sold a dairy farm, and so he had some money, and he asked Mr. Hennessy to invest in the business. Now, Mr. Hennessy put in $300,000 to start with, but it was never properly documented. It wasn't clear whether it was equity or debt. And one thing we do know that it was advanced on an interest-free basis. Now, Mr. Hennessy's lawyer argued that the investment wasn't properly documented because the business's directors refused to sign the security document, which shows that there wasn't a great deal of amity going on there. But anyway, very shortly after that, a few months later, from December 2009 and through to April 2010, Mr. Hennessy started, he's a signatory to the business's bank account, and his other WHK partners, the firm he worked for at the time, were also signatories. And he started paying himself back from the business's bank account. By April 2010, the business owed Mr. Hennessy $160,000 odd, but Mr. X, his trust was owed more than $200,000, so a whole lot more than Mr. Hennessy. In total, the business was estimated to have a net loss of $208,000 odd, and advances from shareholders were $512,000 odd. So clearly a big deficit there. Some very other strange things that happened. Mr. X did have security over those business assets, all those jet skis and motorcycles, at the time that Mr. Hennessy was repaying himself. But Mr. Hennessy failed to advise Mr. X that he had that security, and of course Mr. Hennessy had no such security. From August 2010, the shareholders, including Mr. Hennessy, began taking the business stock for their personal use. But again, no proper records were kept of these informal sort of distributions. Then finally in 2012, Mr. Hennessy put the business in liquidation, and then some of the other shareholders started civil proceedings against him. And that's one reason why it took so long for this complaint to be heard by the New Zealand Institute of Chartered Accountants.
So there seems to be obviously some fairly serious breaches of understanding the nature of conflicts of interest, and yet this seems to be quite basic in terms of what he did. Did the tribunal, the disciplinary committee, make reference to that in terms of his professional development?
He was clearly putting his own, when repaying his own debt, he was clearly putting his own interests before those of Mr. X, who you have to remember was his client. And, the conflict of interest should never have existed in the first place. He shouldn't have allowed it to exist. But because it did, he should have had some sort of way of dealing ethically with it. And clearly he didn't have anything like that. And also record keeping, pretty abysmal.
So, Jenny, just finally, what was the penalty that the tribunal decided to impose?
Well, the prosecutor, Mr. Richard Moon, had wanted Mr. Hennessy to be struck off as a chartered accountant, and that would have meant he couldn't practice at all as a chartered accountant. However, the chairman of the disciplinary tribunal, Mr. Mike Whale, said that striking him off will be disproportionate. But Mr. Whale said a censure on its own also is insufficient punishment for the seriousness of Mr. Hennessy's offending. So he's been struck off he's been suspended from practising as a chartered accountant for 2 years, and he's also paying the cost of the investigation, which is a little bit over $17,000. Another aspect of the penalty is he had been very concerned about the publication of his name and had sought name suppression. Well, clearly that wasn't granted.
Thanks for the update, Jenny Ruth on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett. Open for breakfast, lunch and dinner and everything in between. NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 29th of July. I'm Andrew Patterson. Well, the Brookings Institution's Asia-Pacific Metro Monitor 2014 ranks the 100 largest Asia-Pacific metropolitan economies, which account for 20% of global GDP and 29% of global GDP growth in 2014, saw Auckland as the only New Zealand city to feature in 81st position. However, Auckland Economic Development Agency, ATED, says while it's flattering the city was singled out among Australian competitors as a potential tech centre by an international technology trends expert, it's important to take a less parochial approach. Joining us now is Patrick McVeigh from ATED. Patrick, obviously this is good news in one sense to be acknowledged, but just explain a little bit about the nature of this monitor and how New Zealand got to appear in it.
Well, the Brookings Institution, a fairly well-established think tank out of Washington, D.C., they've been doing work over the years on a whole range of factors around metropolitan economies. And this Metro Monitor that they've just published is the first time that I think they've started to look at comparing cities across that Asia-Pacific region. And in some ways, I think these types of indicators and these types of sort of rankings, they're always quite helpful for shaping some of the discussions and the debates that we may need to have within New Zealand or within any metropolitan region. It's the first time that it's been done. I don't think we should necessarily be overly concerned or surprised about where New Zealand sits. After all, it's looking across the whole of the Asia-Pacific. But I think what it does do is just bring into quite sharp focus that as we're thinking about how our economies grow, we really need to look at where we're positioned globally and how we interact with those global economies and market opportunities that exist for New Zealand, whether that's in Auckland, Wellington or Christchurch. So I think it's a useful contribution to us thinking about where we go next. But at the end of the day, obviously, a set of indicators are only one thing that drives our understanding of what needs to happen.
So you told NBR reporter Sally Lindsay that we need to be careful about believing our own hype. Auckland and the rest of New Zealand have a long way to go to challenge other major players in the Asia-Pacific region. I guess the question that obviously comes out of that is how do you begin to challenge that and to push Auckland up those rankings?
Sure. So I think, first of all, I think we should acknowledge that actually, as an economy, we're doing pretty well, not just in Auckland, but again in the whole of New Zealand. And our opportunity is very much how we look globally. So I think if I think about the key factors that we all need to be thinking about in terms of how do we support future growth of our economies, I'd identify probably 5 main things that we need to be focused on. First is that whole idea that it's our innovation-based and tradable industries that offer the opportunity for growth. So those businesses, those industry sectors, whether they're in services or manufacturing, but those that rely on good inputs in terms of STEM skills, and that where there are really market tradable opportunities. So focusing on those industries which have been shown they generally grow quicker, export more, employ more, they're the ones that are actually going to help move our economy forward. The second and related factor is that it really is about global trade that's actually going to give us those growth opportunities. So domestically, we know we're quite a small market. The opportunities for many of our companies are about looking offshore almost from day one. And so the more that we're building those relationships, and I think the thing that we would argue is, and this is something which comes through in the Brookings work, is it's really about how cities and city regions build relationships. The global economy is increasingly focused on cities. And so how we actually understand our strengths and our tradable opportunities and form relationships with other cities that have a compatible sort of economy. So that's very much the approach that we've been taking with the tripartite agreement that we have, where we're working in China and in LA to really sort of build trading relationships at a city-to-city level. So that's the second factor that's really important. The third thing is that we need to actually continue to invest in the infrastructure that will support growth. And at one level, that's everything from the investments that's being made into broadband to some of the issues around transport investment. And also for us as the economic agency, the work that we're doing around the innovation precinct and Grid AKL as a piece of infrastructure that supports growth. Fourth factor is around talent, and it's global war for talent. Talent's key for our companies and for our economy to grow, and that's got to be at all levels. How we build our youth, how we build our school-age education, how we build in skill sets that are needed for the modern economy, but also how we use our reach in terms of the international student community, and also when we think about international talent attraction. And the final point that I would make, Andrew, is that in all of this, place matters, and place matters increasingly in the context of the global economy. So people's relationship with place, the quality of place factors, the lifestyle offer, all of those things are really important to actually attracting in those innovation-based companies, attracting talent. So 5 key things that I think are that we all need to be thinking about what we do to unlock those growth opportunities. You
also note that it's important that cities work together to embrace advanced industries and all that they can do to grow an economy. We know that New Zealand gets pretty parochial, like most countries, in terms of cities working together. So in practice, how much is this actually a New Zealand Inc. approach as opposed to individual cities looking to do their own things to grow their own economies?
I think there's a couple of different layers to this, Andrew. I think at one level, there are opportunities and there already is collaboration across the different cities, whether that's through networking opportunities or how we work with some of the other economic agencies. And I think under an umbrella, a New Zealand Inc. umbrella, there's a lot of work that can be done. But you do have to have that kind of nuance of what's the role of the different regional economies and how do they relate to that global marketplace. So in some areas, there may be shared opportunities on a sector-by-sector basis that make sense for the different regions across the country to collaborate on how they engage with external markets. In other instances, it's really going to be what's important to that regional economy and where are the other city regions that they can build relationships and trading relationships with. The other layer to this, of course, is to step away from thinking about it from a region-to-region kind of conversation, but more about the business groupings and the sector groupings. So how some of our businesses across the country look to collaborate together to get those sort of entry points into new markets. That also happens. So I think you're familiar with the Kiwi landing pad in San Francisco. You see businesses coming together from all across New Zealand and using that piece of infrastructure to support their engagement with the US market.
In terms of, I guess, the speed with which this has to be achieved, these are quite long-term and quite complex objectives. But how much is there a sense of urgency here in the need for this actually to happen? Perhaps a lot faster than people realise.
Well, I think stuff's happening, and we certainly can, and I think we did this in the article, point to some of the things that we're doing, whether that's work around international talent attraction or whether that's the work that we're doing on things like the innovation precinct. So there is activity happening in Auckland, but also in some of our other regions, and that's good. Can we increase the kind of speed of this? Well, at one level, we're always looking for those opportunities. But I think it's about building some coherent platforms around how we engage. So for us, the way that Auckland's been trying to approach its relationship with its network of sister cities is trying to put that stronger economic lens across that to think about where are the partners, like in the LA context, that we can build some kind of tangible, immediate trading opportunities around those, in this instance, some of those digital content and technology businesses where there is an opportunity, a market opportunity for Auckland, but there's also a clear need on the other side of the equation as well. So, yes, we know we always hear the messages, let's go quicker, let's go harder, and I would endorse some of that. But I think there's also the opportunity just to be clear on the strategic framework within which we're trying to achieve some of these things.
What about the ability to go and court, potential, big players? I mean, just as an example, if Google was to set up a facility in Auckland, clearly that creates a lot of attraction and a lot of interest, and then others come in behind it. How important is it that ultimately much of this can be sped up if you can manage to score one of those big opportunities?
So that sort of business attraction and foreign direct investment of that nature plays an important role in any economy, and it's a good way of driving both employment outcomes and building greater capability in some of the core sectors. I think you do have to look at it on the basis of this is actually about establishing sort of trading relationships and finding the right partners and businesses overseas that both benefit from and contribute to your local ecosystem. So I think it's less of a hunt strategy for any mobile international investment and let's get them here. But where it is linked into where you've got both emergent capabilities and a kind of concentration of relevant companies and businesses, then I think that's a really important strategy that we, as New Zealand, but also as Auckland, we're looking to do more around. But I would go back to, for that strategy to be effective and sustainable over the longer term, you also need to look at those factors so that I'd previously identified. So getting a Google would be fantastic, but we also have to be dealing with the talent side of the equation so that we know that we can actually put through the right number of graduates, the right sort of nature of the labour force for them. And that comes back to how we develop our own skills base and also how we drive targeted talent attraction strategies. And then initiatives like the new ICT graduate school that we'll be rolling out, that has also a role to play in ensuring that what we're building is a talent base that can sustain our aspirations around some of those global businesses that might move here.
So just finally, we come in at 81st in this current poll. Where would you like to see Auckland in, say, a couple of years' time when this poll is done, say, in 2018, 2019?
Well, I haven't looked with a fine-tooth comb at which of the indicators that have the greatest opportunity to change and move us up. So, of course, I would want to see us moving up the rankings and probably competing against some of those cities that we may benchmark ourselves against on that list. If we think about the list, it includes cities like San Francisco. So obviously we're never going to look quite the same as them. What I would be focused on is how do we grow the contribution of some of our sectors that fit in that kind of advanced industries category. So how do we actually think about those both manufacturing and services industries that are reliant upon sort of STEM skills to grow and are where there's tradable opportunities. I think if we focus on those sort of fundamental factors, then that's what's going to give us the opportunity to move up the rankings rather than necessarily being too concerned about where do we sit on the rankings. It's more, are we focused on the right areas that will grow our economy? And whether we go from 81st to 80th or 80th to 75 should be a outcome of some of those activities rather than the reason we're doing it.
Appreciate you joining us, speaking to AT General Manager Business Innovation and Skills, Patrick McVeigh, here on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio. Free to air online with business news you can use.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. Colin Craig to sue what he calls the Dirty Politics Brigade. Tex Edward puts his 2 degree shares on Trade Me. Westland Milk lowers its milk payout forecast. PwC fails to halt a $300 million lawsuit. Abano wants $1 billion from dentistry in 10 years. And Wheeler gives a speech with the hope of lowering the dollar, but it goes up. To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio. To the Governor's speech. Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler today delivered a sideswipe at critics who say he's not cutting interest rates fast enough. The Governor also gave an oblique dig at economic pessimists. Some calls for large interest rate cuts, he told a business audience in Tauranga, imply the economy is heading backwards. He told an Export New Zealand breakfast in Tauranga some commentators have predicted large declines in interest rates over coming months that could only be consistent with the economy moving into recession. He says we will review our growth forecast in the September monetary policy statement, but at this point, we believe that while demand and output growth may be a little below trend, several factors are supporting economic growth. Those factors include a strong services sector, still the largest part of the economy, record highs in labour force participation, and similar records being breached in net migration figures along with ongoing growth in construction. The Reserve Bank has been criticised for not cutting the OCR more quickly and sooner. Consumer price index inflation is virtually zero and a long way from its target of the midpoint between 1% to 3%. And critics have charged the central bank with being technically in breach of its policy targets agreement. Mr. Wheeler says, however, that the agreement with the government also requires the central bank to avoid, where possible, volatility in output, interest rates and the exchange rate. He said attempting to return inflation to the midpoint quickly could create the risk of overshooting the inflation goal, unanchoring inflation expectations, and increasing the volatility of interest rates and the exchange rate as monetary policy is significantly eased and subsequently tightened. The Governor also, somewhat surprisingly, devoted a significant part of his speech to the technical but highly important issue of whether the official cash rate now, after last week's cut at 3%, is below a neutral level. Above neutral means the OCR is acting as a dampening influence on price inflation. Below means it's still stimulatory of the economy overall. The Reserve Bank has in recent years maintained neutral as somewhere between 4 to 4.5%, lower than what was assumed prior to the global financial crisis, although back then the Reserve Bank was more coy about talking about what it did consider to be neutral. There's an argument the neutral level is now lower than 4%. The effect of even lower inflation globally, plus local measures such as the loan-to-value ratio rules, taking some of the heat off monetary policy measures. For the first time, Mr. Wheeler says this could be the case. He says while the present data still backs up the Reserve Bank's stance, officials are continuing to reflect on the issue. The very low level of global rates could mean that the effective neutral rate may be at the bottom end of or below this range. As for where to next, there will be a full update in the September 10 monetary policy statement. Mr. Wheeler says there is a run of economic data between now and then, and this will have a major bearing on how far and how fast the Reserve Bank continues to cut interest rates. The job market, both employment and wage growth, is critical, and there is an updated set of figures being released next week by Stats New Zealand. Mr. Wheeler says thus far wage growth has been modest, as has price increases. Inflation expectations are low, he says. We view the current monetary policy settings as providing stimulus to the economy at a time when output looks to be growing around 2.5%. At the same time, Mr. Wheeler says the exchange rate needs to fall further to reflect the fall in dairy prices and other economic factors. He says at current levels of export prices, a more sustainable exchange rate depreciation is required to stabilise the net external liabilities position relative to GDP. To that travel tax. A consortium of travel industry organisations, from airlines to accommodation providers to cruise ship operators, say a proposed border tax will cut international visitor numbers and spending. The Coalition Against Travel Tax, or CAT, led by the Tourism Industry Association, or TIA, says the border clearance levy introduced in the May budget will be a handbrake on burgeoning travel numbers. In a submission opposing the levy, CAT says an independent analysis commissioned by the government estimates overseas visitor numbers will drop by 1.4% and cut their expenditure 0.9%. This equates to a loss of 44,000 visitors a year and spending of $104 million, according to CAT spokesman and TIA Chief Executive Chris Roberts. He says further analysis from the international airline and cruise industries suggests this may underestimate the impact. For example, the International Airlines Organisation IATA says it would cost the aviation industry $33 million in lost revenue and cut 200 jobs. The loss to tourism would be $196 million and job losses of 1,700. This is based on the impact in other countries that have imposed or cut travel taxes. The proposed costs of more than $20 per return air trip would be 3 times the average net profit that Asia Pacific Airlines make on each passenger. The extra levy on cruise ship passengers, who could pay up to $26, could cost that industry up to $85.2 million in added value losses and 1,600 jobs in the 2018-19 year, according to an estimate. New Zealanders will make up almost half of the travellers required to pay the travel tax as they leave and arrive. CAT has urged the government to delay the empowering legislation passed immediately after Budget 2015 until the 1st of January 2017 to minimise its impact. It also says the tax should be zero-rated for GST. The government says the levy is to help offset the cost of border protection provided by the Ministry for Primary Industries and New Zealand Customs.
Wednesday the 29th of July, NBR Radio, I'm Andrew Patterson. Well, accountancy firm PwC has lost a court attempt to halt a $300 million lawsuit over its auditing of David Henderson's failed property development firm, Property Ventures. Following the case, our reporter Tim Hunter, who joins me now. Tim, what's at issue here?
This is quite a long-running dispute, and PwC is one of 9 defendants in this case. And it dates back to the collapse of property developer David Henderson's development group, Property Ventures, and its associated companies. And the liquidator in Christchurch basically has nothing to go on in terms of recovering money for creditors, except for this lawsuit that he's filed against directors and PwC as the firm's former auditor. So basically, he's alleging that their handling of the company's affairs was inadequate, and that he's hoping that insurance that covers their behaviour can actually lead to some payout for creditors.
And one of Property Ventures' creditors, Allied Farmers, owed $40 million after acquiring the loan assets, of course, from Hanover Finance in 2009. They'd be very happy to get something back.
Well, one of the unusual things about this case in particular is that Allied Farmers sold its interest in that loan to the litigation funder in the case, which is LPF Group. Now, it didn't get an awful lot of money for that, perhaps reflecting its desperation at the time and the remoteness potentially of any ultimate payment. So Allied got $100,000 plus 5% of any ultimate payout. So LPF Group then became a direct creditor of Property Ventures. Now, this has actually been a material aspect of this particular case because the accountancy firm PwC was basically challenging the lawsuit brought by the liquidators on the grounds that the litigation funding agreement was contrary to rules and legal customs around litigation funding of a case like this, because LPF had an additional interest. And it's quite an interesting case for that from that point of view, because litigation funding is still, I guess, relatively young in this country, and it's quite common for all litigation funding agreements to be challenged by defendants in court just to see whether there's any whether they are legitimate, and this one is quite unusual.
So Allied Farmers potentially could get something more out of this if it is successful?
It could. Although there's something more was likely to be quite small. Allied's accounts have said that they potentially might get a further 500,000. So they're not expecting a huge amount. One of the things that PwC is concerned about here is that even if, let's say the claim is successful, and the liquidators are claiming ultimately $302.5 million. If that claim is successful, the only beneficiary of that claim will end up really being LPF, because it's getting a big share of the payout through its litigation funding agreement, which, according to this court judgment, is 42% or so of the payout, which is quite a hefty chunk. And then of what's left, it's also the major creditor. And so PwC were saying, well, ultimately, if this thing goes down to the wire and the claim is successful, which I'm sure they think it won't be, then LPF gets all the money and no other creditors really get anything. And they're basically saying, well, that means that this litigation funding agreement, in combination with with its rights to the former Allied debt, make this an abusive process in the court's eyes.
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at $100,000 price to buy the potential downstream of 300 million, that's cost benefit ratio is reasonably good.
Yes, well, there's some outrageous potential profit margin that LPF could ultimately get if it was completely successful. It's in the thousands of percent. So the likelihood of that, though, you'd have to say would be less than certain.
Sure, that's right. We're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here because there are quite a substantial number of documents to be gone through in discovery here.
That's right. Now that, assuming, well, PwC could technically appeal, but let's say it doesn't appeal this particular judgment. The next stage in this litigation, as I understand it, is that the defendants will formally complete their statements of defence, and the case will move to discovery of documentation. And there are hundreds of thousands of pages of documents that will have to be gone through by the defence, and that's going to take quite a long time. So I don't think anyone's holding their breath for any court hearing if it gets that far, to be happening potentially until maybe 2017.
All right, so this case still has a lot to happen yet, but it will be an interesting one to follow. And also, I suppose, as you say, from this idea of litigation funding, it will presumably throw up a few potential precedents for the future as well.
Yes, well, the judge obviously has ruled that this particular arrangement with LPF, between LPF and the liquidators, was not a breach of an abusive court process, and was not a problem in that legal sense of champerty, which is the big issue with litigation funding. So, in that sense, it's been interesting from a legal point of view. The issues that will potentially be traversed in the case itself are hugely significant in the history of finance company fallout, because they will cover really the actions of directors and the auditor in how they ran the company at the time when it was going through serious risk. So those issues will shed an awful lot of light on really how a property company like Property Ventures collapsed after the crisis.
Which could, in fact, then spur a whole series of litigation back to the finance companies again.
Well, that's right. There might be some stuff that comes out of this that will prompt further activity, and there's a whole nest of implications and relationships that go beyond Property Ventures and extend into Hanover Finance in particular. And obviously that one has had a fair bit of an airing, and everyone thinks it's all gone away. But there could potentially still be some mileage there, particularly in the role of PwC.
The finance company could almost be described as an industry potentially for litigation down the track.
Well, yes. Although it's taken a long time to get there, I must say. It's been one of the great outrages, really, of the finance company scandal, is that so little litigation and action seems to have been taken until quite some years after the big problems arose. So, litigation funding company LPF has basically said that it's trying to put that right by taking action, and certainly it's a good thing that these issues will get an airing.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us, Tim Hunter, following the case of PwC failing to halt a $300 million lawsuit over the audit of David Henderson's failed property development firm Property Ventures, here on NBR Radio.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
Wednesday the 29th of July, this is NBR Radio, I'm Andrew Patterson. The Labour Party has joined the chorus against the free trade agreements, and in particular the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Among the claims of TPP critics is that such agreements give multinational companies rights to sue governments. In his editor's insight today, Neville Gibson says TPP critics are wrong, that this threatens sovereignty. So, Neville, why are they wrong?
Well, what the critics are talking about are clauses in the free trade agreements that provide mechanisms to settle legal disputes between companies and governments. These have been going on for the best part of a century now, ever since the imperial days when colonial nations from Europe set up businesses in other countries and wanted some rights for those investors. Now, these have been modified into quite a big network of tribunals, mediation, arbitration, those sort of things, quite outside the legal systems. These are called investor-state settlement disputes, and for some reason the critics of the TPP have focused in on this, even though they've been written into most modern free trade agreements. And they're necessary because when you're dealing in a global businesses, you're often dealing with countries that have very dodgy, not to say corrupt, legal systems where if you're a foreigner, even if you're a citizen, you have basically no rights at all. But in fact, with China, which would be one of those sort of legal systems, we have one of these ISDS agreements, so there's no problem with China.
So will countries lose their sovereignty as a result of these settlements? Well,
that's the claim, that somehow the multinational companies are going to get these extra powers over countries and right to do things. But in fact, where the critics are wrong is they've usually pick on a couple of examples, and the ones they most use, that Germany wanted to ban nuclear power. So obviously there were some nuclear power companies that were upset about that, so they have been able to take action. And also over tobacco, where some countries, Australia among them, want to put cigarettes into plain packaging, and these companies have rights to oppose that, so they're doing that. Fonterra at the other end found that when it became involved in that contaminated infant formula scandal in China a few years ago, it had absolutely no rights. Fonterra has also been attacked in Sri Lanka, where local farmers said that they were selling a faulty product, and Fonterra found that in the courts that couldn't get anywhere. In China, picking on foreign companies, the likes of McDonald's, KFC over food, or foreign car makers or pharmaceutical companies accused of profiteering, have found they have no rights whatsoever, and that's what these ISDS means of settling these disputes outside of those countries before independent tribunals and judges and so on is quite a good case. But the worst case that's just come up in the last few months involves Nestle and India.
So what is this Nestle case all about?
Well, this is all over so-called unsafe amounts of lead in Maggi instant noodles. Now, these noodles are one of the biggest selling food items you can buy in the streets of India and in the shops. And Nestlé's had to go to court to defend these charges. And the initial reports were made by a single laboratory inspector, a food inspector, in one state, and this got picked up by the National Food Safety thing, and Nestlé was ordered by the government to withdraw all the noodle products and then destroy them. Yet around the world, these same products meet all the world's food standards and are being consumed without a problem. But the problem is that India has a highly bureaucratic sort of system, and Nestlé's become quite a victim of it, and is, particularly with the destroying of the stocks and all that kind of thing, and the product is still off the market.
So the cost to Nestlé must have been enormous.
It certainly has been, and just this week the chief executive of Nestlé India, which is a separate company, he's had to go back to Switzerland and be replaced. The big chief executive, Paul Bulker, from Switzerland, he's had to go to China and subject himself to a televised press conference, just like the Fonterra head had to go to China and do the same thing, and apparently is berated by Indian reporters there. But there have been some reports in the business press on the costs. Now, the first big cost was about $200 million. That was wiped off the Maggi brand. That was done by a company called Brand Finance. It's a global company, and they said that the Maggi brand, which is worth well over $2 billion to Nestlé, has been cut. Also, there were other costs. One of them was the 180 million estimated lost sales, and those are direct costs of destroying the product and that sort of thing. Nestlé India has lost around about $140 million worth of value on the share market there since this thing broke. And then, of course, they're going to have to relaunch the product and restore all that lost product, and that's going to cost them around about $70 million. Now, Nestlé's in court at the moment in India, but it is not pursuing this compensation case. I don't think there's probably any grounds for that one at all.
So what's the likely outcome of the case?
Well, they might get some steering from the courts. The Indian courts, of course, are quite independent, and you never know what they're going to do. They're not run by the government as they are in Russia or China. But Nestlé is there arguing about the nature of the food standards. They call them pretty dodgy. There's and the enforcing of them is pretty unclear. Now, take the case of the noodles and how they found this so-called high levels of lead, is that they tested the product. When you buy a pack of these noodles, you get the noodles and then you get a little flavour pack. Apparently what the Indians did is they took the flavour pack and then measured that and without any water or noodles, and said that there was a high degree of lead in it. And Nestlé says, well, that's you're always going to get traces of lead in this particular thing if you've got certain flavours in it, and that if you mixed it all together, there would be no danger at all, and that is the standard practice with these noodles all around the world, where, of course, there's been no problem whatsoever.
Oh, fascinating case. Maybe an interesting one to follow through. Thanks for joining us with your insights today, Neville Gibson on NBR Radio.
Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today. www.nbr.co.nz/subscribe. NBR.
Let's talk wages parity. According to a report released by ANZ Bank today, on average, Kiwi women earn $608,000 less than men over their lifetime, despite New Zealand having one of the smaller gender pay gaps in the OECD. The research is part of a campaign by the bank to raise awareness of the looming gender gap in retirement savings, with women forecast to retire with an average $59,000 less than men, with just $144,000 compared to $203,000. ANZ said from October it will top up KiwiSaver contributions for female and male staff on parental leave, and called on other Kiwi employers to follow suit. It's also increasing paid parental leave from 16 to 18 weeks from next year. ANZ General Manager Human Resources Felicity Evans said many women take time out of work to raise families and stop contributing to KiwiSaver during this time. She said women have made great strides on the education front, with more New Zealand working women having a bachelor degree than men, and New Zealand now has one of the highest proportion of women with a tertiary qualification, second only to Canada. There are also more women in the workforce, with 63% working or actively looking for work, which is up from 54% 10 years ago, while the male employment rate is unchanged at 75%. Women are 1.2 times more likely than men to be employed in professional roles, but 50% less likely to be employed as managers. According to OECD figures, New Zealand's gender pay gap stacks up well relative to the rest of the developed countries at 6.2% of the male median wage, compared to the OECD average of 16% in 2012. However, the latest Stats New Zealand figures for 2014, comparing the median hourly earnings of men and women in full and part-time work, puts the pay gap at 9.9%. New Zealand women earned an average $300 less per week than men in 2014, which equates to around $608,400 over their lifetime, according to the bank. Ms Evans says clearly this has implications on the amount of money women can save for their future retirement. The research also showed on average Kiwi women live longer than men and are retired for 20 years compared to 14 years for men, so their savings need to last longer. But after 8 years of KiwiSaver, average balances for women members of the bank scheme are almost 28% lower than men, which is up from 26.5% the previous year. In a market update, Abano Healthcare's incoming managing director says the dental business is on track to reach $1 billion in turnover within 10 years. Currently, Abano's dental business in Australia and New Zealand has $240 million in annualised revenue, according to Chief Financial Officer Richard Keys, who takes over from Alan Clark when he retires at the annual meeting. Mr Keys said on a conference call with analysts and investors, the future for Abano is looking very positive. The opportunities are very large, particularly in our dental market. A key factor in driving dental growth will be the branding of the Australian operations, and Abano will unveil the new brand at a conference of about 280 dentists on the Gold Coast this weekend. Abano's New Zealand dental operations have been branded Lumino the Dentist since 2005. The Australian brand will be different but won't be revealed until the conference. Among the hoopla of the launch will be the de rigueur t-shirts and caps, but Abano will also be giving out free mini iPads with the new brand's own app to facilitate communication with the Australian dentists. Mr Keys says currently for every dollar Abano spends on marketing Lumino, it gets $7 back in revenue. He says it took 5 years to persuade all the New Zealand dentists to adopt the Lumino brand. He said, we don't force people to do things, we very much want them to pull. But he expects it will take less time to win over the Australian dentists, partly because they're already aware of the New Zealand experience, and partly because the poor state of the Australian economy is likely to encourage them. Mr Keys says, we think the pull over there is much stronger than it was in New Zealand. I would expect the brand rollout to be much faster. The dental operations lifted gross revenue 12% to $211.1 million in the year ended May, accounting for 70% of group revenue, while underlying earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation rose 14% to $25.1 million. Mr Clark says it will take some time for the new Australian brand to gain name recognition. In New Zealand, the Lumino brand has about 85% prompted awareness when people are asked if they recognise different brands, and about 53% unprompted awareness when people are asked to name a dentist. Mr Clark says that's a bizarre statistic. We're up there with Watties.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 29th of July. I'm Andrew Patterson, and with me, Chris Hutching. Chris, Westland Milk putting out its forecast today, and what did you read about some of the insights that they are providing at a time of obviously quite significant turbulence in the sector?
Well, Westland Milk are trying to move ahead with this value-added concept, and they have a couple of projects on the go. They have some offices direct in Shanghai. They also have, on the local level in Rolleston, which is near Christchurch, they've got a UHT milk plant underway there. You know, the UHT is their long life milk that you can use when you go camping or whatever you like, and keep it in places other than a fridge. So that's one idea. They've also got some baby infant formula products that they're developing as well to export direct. So they are trying to get away from the commodity thing, but, you know, like all the milk companies, it is the predominant export is still milk powder. In terms of the West Coast, well, it's a kind of a pity for them in a way because, as we all know, they've suffered from the downturn in mining, all these extractive industries that have, you know, generally been the main things over there, and this is kind of another bit of a negative for them. Hopefully offset by tourism increases, which the tourism industry is going well, but milk was really probably the big thing that was holding up the West Coast economy to a degree, aside from those other extractive industries that we've talked about. So, yeah, it's a bit of a bummer for them.
And they have revised down their forecast operating payment by around 10 cents.
Yes. It still leaves them slightly ahead of Fonterra, and they have always been able to do this. I'm not 100% sure why, but they would tell me, their PR people would tell me it's because they're nimble and quick and all those sorts of things. So it's not quite. They're slightly better off than the Fonterra suppliers at this stage, but I guess they're just weathering the same sorts of things that all the suppliers are throughout the country. And as we can see from some of the futures markets, the expectations of the market generally are that this thing is not going to turn around in a great hurry.
And did they indicate what impact all of this will have on their capital expenditure plans?
No, because I think that some of those were underway, but they are, of course, having to look very closely at all their costs, expenses now. So I doubt that they'll be cutting back on their capital expenditure on these new products that I was talking about before, the infant nutrition and the UHT, because that's that's the way of the future. That would be a mistake, wouldn't it? But certainly they are looking at reviewing all their freight and that type of thing. Staff costs, they're all coming under the microscope now.
And just finally, they noted that price volatility is at extreme levels, a fall of more than 20% in 1 month, and in fact prices in New Zealand dollars now lower than during the global financial crisis. Obviously, this puts a lot of pressure on what is a much smaller entity than Fonterra. How difficult is it for a company like Westland Milk, I guess, to weather this storm compared to its much bigger competitor, Fonterra?
Well, I mentioned before that, their PR people would tell us the story that they're more nimble and quicker, and there's an element of truth in that, I think, and this is evident from the way that they have managed to maintain their payments slightly above Fonterra. Obviously, when Fonterra is a giant compared with Westland. Westland is really quite a small company, even though it is the second largest after Fonterra. So I would say that they probably do have a slightly better outlook than Fonterra to be able to initiate some of these things, because basically it's a smaller operation. You've probably got more idea of what's going on. Whereas when you have something like Fonterra, they become a massive bureaucracy, and they're quite hard probably to even tell what everyone's supposed to be doing half the time. So
yeah,
Fonterra. Now Fonterra is going down this path of a great restructure, but I don't know if we'll see quite the same thing there at Westland.
Yes, good point. Small and nimble can be an advantage in volatile times. Thanks for the insights, Chris Hutching, with us on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant, an unparalleled private dining room choice. NBR Radio.
To a lifetime of investing. According to research into market cycles by global asset management firm Russell Investments, an investor is likely to go through 9 market upturns and downturns over their lifetime. Since 1926, the US stock market has gone through 16 market cycles, each of which has gone through the same stages, from euphoria to despondency. Tim Noonan, Managing Director of Russell's Capital Market Insights in the US, told the New Zealand Investment Summit in Auckland on Tuesday, despite the emotional journey for investors, the point of maximum financial risk is when the market hits euphoria at the peak of the cycle, and conversely, the point of financial opportunity is when it's at the nadir and people are most despondent. Mr. Noonan said the world is presently going through a difficult market recovery, but investors won't know it's complete until the US Fed Reserve and other central banks start lifting interest rates. Although market cycles are a given fact of trading, no two are the same, and most people fail to understand them properly. He said you can't predict a future cycle on the basis of a previous one. He said there are 3 phases that exist in every cycle: the downturn from the market peak, the recovery, and then expansion beyond the previous market peak. Every cycle can vary markedly in duration and magnitude. Typically, he said, downturns have lasted 13 months, recovery 25 months, and expansion 31 months. but the last two cycles have been deeper and longer than before. He said the best way for investors to ride out market cycles is to have a long-term focus on value-based investing rather than an intra-cycle focus based on following market sentiment. Following widespread debate over the problem of short-termism in financial markets, the Sydney-based Centre for International Finance and Regulation researched how institutional investors might adopt a long-term approach. The research included discussions with New Zealand and Australian superannuation funds. Dr. Jeff Warren, a researcher director for CIFR, told the conference long-term investing and having a set time frame to get your money out do not go together. There are three broad advantages to getting rid of time pressures around investment decisions. He said long-term investors can focus on whether rather than when a particular investment return will actually be achieved, which allows them to chase opportunities that others with short horizons won't consider. Another advantage is being able to exploit opportunities arising from the actions of short-term investors, such as premiums associated with risks short-term investors won't take on. An example would be investing in property when the market hits the bottom because long-term investors can ride out the cycle. Mr. Warren said the third advantage is that long-term investors can typically take on a wider range of investments, including more illiquid and unlisted assets which offer exposure to returns not available on listed markets. But the pitfalls include making the wrong predictions about what the long term holds, which can mean money being tied up in an investment that underperforms for an extended period before the mistake is recognised. It can also be hard to stay the course under a long-term investment approach when external managers may focus on short-term performance and when employees' bonuses and incentives are based on that too. Mr. Warren said solutions include aligning the organisational structure to set the right incentives for a long-term investment approach, building a culture led from the top with a clear objective to add value over time rather than respond to market volatility, and communicating to all stakeholders what the long-term objectives are with each investment rather than monitoring by the numbers. In market news, Sky City Entertainment Group will face a smaller than expected increase in operating costs after Australia's Northern Territory government completed its review of the state's gaming taxes. The company estimates a new 10-year community benefit levy will add an extra $1 million in operating costs to Sky City. The company had previously estimated the casino levy in the Northern Territory could cost it as much as $6 million a year. The levy applies from July 1, and if there are any changes in the rate over the next decade, Sky City will be able to offset any licence or regulatory fee against the gaming tax. In May, the company said its Darwin casino continued to experience challenging trading conditions. Sky City's Northern Territory casino generated revenue of $73.1 million Australian in the 6 months ended December 31st, and earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation of $21.6 million. Sky City shares last traded at $4.19 and have gained 8% this year. In charity news, the Pasture Renewal Charitable Trust is holding a rebranding cocktail function on Wednesday, July 29 on the Wellington waterfront. According to its project manager, Tim Woods, the beneficiaries of the trust include all New Zealanders as well as rural property owners, but indirectly its beneficiaries probably also include 14 agribusiness companies, which are its sponsors. They began to work in 2007 to promote more frequent pasture renewal. The companies pay an annual sponsorship to the trust to fund activities, including a communications strategy underpinned by market research with farmers and a literature review on research on pastoral renewal. The aim is to communicate why more frequent pasture renewal is a beneficial investment for New Zealand's farmers. In the publicity material, farmers are requested to contact Dairy New Zealand for further information on the best approach and techniques for pasture renewal. The Trust's management team comprises Chairman Murray Willix, Chief Executive of New Zealand Agri-Seeds, John Carradis, Chief Executive of Grasslands Technology, Tony Leggett, Managing Editor of NZX Agri, Nicholas Smith, Marketing Manager of New Farm New Zealand, Ance Roberts, Chief Scientific Officer, Ravensdown Fertiliser Co-op, and Grady Bennett, Category Procurement Manager. Project Manager Mr. Wood says the trustees and legal advisors have been all over the trust's deed because of the recent crackdown by the Charities Commission to cull out entities it deems do not have charitable purposes as defined in legislation. Mr. Wood says pasture renewal is good for the nation. Currently, the level of pasture renewal is low.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
Let's talk reaction to Graham Wheeler's speech. Reserve Bank Governor Graham Wheeler's highly anticipated speech this morning made the dollar gain value despite him saying a further exchange rate depreciation is necessary. After an initial dip to 66 US cents, the New Zealand dollar jumped past the previous week's high of 67 and on its way to a high of 67.4. The New Zealand dollar trade-weighted index rose 0.5% after the speech and is up more than 2% since the OCR review, rising to 71.30 from 71.04. Mr. Wheeler dropped plenty of hints that he's looking for the New Zealand dollar to shed a bit of value. He said this morning further exchange rate depreciation is necessary, given the weakness in our export commodity prices and the projected deterioration in the country's net external liabilities over the next 2 years. At current levels of export prices, a more substantial exchange rate depreciation will be required to stabilise the net external liabilities position relative to GDP. TD Securities Chief Asia Pacific macro strategist Annette Beecher says Mr. Wheeler is attempting to jawbone the currency to a lower level, which evidently did not work. Ms. Beecher says the Reserve Bank needed to hint at many more rate cuts to effectively jawbone the dollar lower today. Ms. Beecher says today's speech was merely an elaboration of last week's official cash rate review. Westpac senior economist Michael Gordon says financial markets were surprised by the governor's comments this morning. He says financial markets were anticipating a less dovish tone from today's speech in light of last week's OCR review. ANZ senior FX strategist Sam Tuck says the market reaction is for New Zealand dollar to go higher as markets continue to reduce their short New Zealand dollar positions. He adds that Mr. Wheeler managed to reduce market expectations for further OCR moves with only minimal impact on the highly positioned currency. He says the dairy price is a key consideration for currency traders at the moment, and people will be watching the August GDT auctions very closely. If dairy prices continue to show large declines, as seen in the past couple of GDT auctions, expect the New Zealand dollar to continue to depreciate and the sentiment to turn. To the telecommunications industry, M2 New Zealand Chief Executive Mark Callender says a Roku pilot in Dunedin has gone very well, and an expansion to other centres will definitely be considered as the fight for content play heats up with RSPs or retail service providers. M2 New Zealand, formerly Call Plus Group, was on the back foot in the content brawl last month as it scrapped its global mode service to settle legal action brought by Sky TV, TVNZ, Lightbox owner Spark and MediaWorks, who in turn agreed to drop a High Court case. But with the $100 Roku, which is a little gadget that connects a regular television to the internet and features apps for the likes of Hulu and Netflix, M2 has quietly opened up a new front in the streaming video on demand war, or SVOD. The pilot sees customers of M2's Orcon brand in Dunedin given a Roku device if they sign up for a 1 gig UFB fibre plan. Mr. Callender's comment to NBR comes on the heels of news that Telstra will launch a new SVOD service across the Tasman in September, centred on a Roku 2 device. Roku is supported by Netflix New Zealand, but can also be easily adjusted to get offshore versions of streaming services. M2 says traffic to all versions of Netflix now accounts for more than 20% of its total network traffic. The company's competition in the increasingly crowded SVOD market will soon include 2 Degrees, which is working on a content play likely to involve a partner. Yesterday, 2 Degrees launched its first 2 Degrees branded home broadband service. In court news, accountancy firm PwC has lost a court attempt to halt a $300 million lawsuit over its auditing of David Henderson's failed property development firm Property Ventures. PwC, one of 9 defendants in the case brought by Property Ventures liquidators, had requested a stay order on the grounds that litigation funding arrangements involving LPEF Group were an abusive process. In a ruling delivered at the Christchurch High Court on Tuesday, Justice Brendan Brown declined to grant PwC's request. The case follows the collapse in 2010 of Mr. Henderson's development group Property Ventures, which had built up large debts to several finance companies, particularly for a project on the outskirts of Queenstown known as 5 Mile. One of Property Ventures' creditors was Allied Farmers, owed $40 million after acquiring loan assets from Hanover Finance in 2009. In chasing a way to get money back for creditors of the Property Ventures Group, liquidator Robert Walker filed a lawsuit in 2012 seeking compensation from its directors and auditor PwC. Since Property Ventures had no resources left of its own, the litigation was financed by a deal with specialist financier LPF. According to Justice Brown's ruling, the deal gives LPF 42.5% of money realised through the litigation. However, LPF's funding was conditional on concluding separate arrangements with Allied, which involved buying Allied's rights to the $40 million debt. In exchange, LPF paid Allied $100,000 and agreed to give it 5% of any net amount gained through the litigation. PwC argued that the combination of the 2 arrangements meant the liquidator's litigation had effectively been assigned to LPF and was an abusive process, because LPF would get 2 bites at the cherry, one from the 42.5% funding fee and another from its ownership of the Allied loan. It said the litigation will overwhelmingly benefit only LPF, a third-party litigation funder with no antecedent interest in the subject matter of the litigation, whose only interest is to make excessive and disproportionate profit. With interest accruing on the former Allied loan at 21%, if the case reached court in June 2017, the debt would reach $188 million. As a result, PwC argued no other creditor would get any money unless the settlement sum was at least $334 million. However, Justice Brown said PwC had failed to show the LPF arrangements were an abusive process or an improper assignment of the case. LPF's purchase of Allied's interest made no difference to the cause of action or the potential outcome, he said. Nor did LPF's twofold benefit amount to excessive profiteering because it was simply the combination of two separate interests. If Allied had retained its loan asset, the amount due would not change. Justice Brown said this is not a situation where, in analysing SPF's return, it can be said that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and the second of the two parts is the debt owed to the first secured creditor. The claims against directors include failure to keep proper accounting records, breach of directors' duties and breach of fiduciary duties, while against PwC, the claims involve breach of contract and tort, which is an allegation that the auditor had a duty of care to PVL and did not fulfil it, causing damage. PwC denies the claims, as do the directors.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett, partying since 1959. www.hoteldebret.com. NBR Radio.